Hello, students. Mr. Gay here in the bunker of science. We're talking about fetal circulatory system. So, bebés. We're talking about bebés. Fetal circulatory system is a little bit different than an adult or not an adult, a born, a non-fetal circulatory system. And the reason for that is because babies don't have any air to breathe. There's no air inside a mum. There's no air sacs. Inside the placenta, it is fluid filled. So the pulmonary circuit is useless. Doesn't do anything. In fact, the lungs are collapsed and all the little air sacs in the lungs, lungs are sort of like a sponge. Well, imagine the sponge is all squished, condensed. So the lung tissue is very dense. As a result, all the capillaries that are in that lung tissue are also squished, and they actually provide a lot of resistance. Blood doesn't want to go in there. There's a little bit of blood flow, a tiny little bit of blood flow, but it's like, imagine a sponge that is being squished. Water doesn't want to go in it. There's no room to go in, so it's just a little bit of blood. So the pulmonary circuit, on the right side, on the right atrium, so the right ventricle, which pumps to the pulmonary arteries, got basically nowhere to pump because that circuit is more or less closed off. Blood can flow there. There's the right atrium, but once it gets to the lungs, it's very slow. There's a great deal of resistance. So what the fetal heart has then is there's sort of two additional structures in the fetal heart. Number one, there is something called the Foramen Ovale. The Foramen Ovale. And what the Foramen Ovale does, is there a gooder image of the Foramen Ovale? Oh, here we go. This kind of works. Okay, so there's the right atrium, which normally would be blue, which receives deoxygenated blood from the vena cava. And normally the right atrium, blood gets pumped into the right ventricle. It still does. But there's another way for the blood to go. There's a little opening here, another valve essentially, called that Foramen Ovale, which connects to the left atrium. Remember the left atrium? That's when blood, so basically this blood can bypass the pulmonary circuit, doesn't have to go to the lungs and come back from the lungs. It just goes right into, from the right atrium into the left atrium via this hole that is between the two atria in the heart, just like that. So that's one. Now, some of the blood goes into the right ventricle and it gets pumped out, and some of it goes to the lungs. But then a lot of it doesn't, because there is another bypass, and it is called the arterial duct. The arterial duct right here. And it connects the pulmonary artery to the aortic arch, to the aorta. Remember, the aorta is the end, is the start, of the systemic circuit. So that's going out from the aorta. You're going out to all the tissues, all the systems of the body, all the tissues in the body. So you are completely bypassing. You've got these two. You got the foramen ovale and the arterial duct that bypass the pulmonary circuit. Still, blood is going into the pulmonary circuit, but a lot less because it's just not needed there. So there's the lungs there's no oxygen that is in the lungs. The blood doesn't get oxygenated in the lungs. The only reason that blood goes there is for the tissue development, because the lungs are still growing. Those tissues are still developing and growing in the fetus, so it's going there to nourish those tissues. It's not going there for oxygen exchange. So where does the fetus get its oxygen? If it doesn't get it from the air, where does it get it? Does it have gills? Does it get it from water? No. Where the fetus gets oxygenated blood, where it gets its oxygen, is from the mother, the mama bear. Women, amazingly, they grow a baby inside their bodies. They also grow an additional organ. So when a woman becomes pregnant, the lining of the uterus it grows into an extra organ called the placenta. And basically what the placenta is, we sort of see a bit of it here. You can see that pretty good. What the placenta is a sac of blood. A giant sac of blood, the mother's blood, okay? It's just filled with oxygenated, nutrient-rich blood. And the baby's circulatory system extends out through the umbilical cord, extends out into capillaries that go into that sac of blood. Now, the bloods never directly mix. There is no mixing of the bloods. The bloods don't mix. There is a membrane around, tissue around the baby's blood vessels, those umbilical vessels that are going into the placenta, into those capillaries. And so, and there are transport proteins all along here that work to take nutrients, to take stuff. Oxygen diffuses into here, wastes diffuse out into the placenta, and there's an exchange. There's a gas exchange and a nutrient exchange. And also immunoglobulins, actually some immunoglobulins, so some antibodies and things are passed on from the mother to the baby. So the mother is giving part of her immune system to the baby. So if you have a good immune system and you're a mom, your baby will have a good immune system. You take care of yourself, you've got good immunity, your baby will have good immunity. Some parts of, things to identify, so there's the umbilical cord that comes out of your belly button. And so there's the umbilical vein and the umbilical arteries. Now, this is one of those cases where the umbilical arteries are moving away from the baby's heart and they carry deoxygenated, waste-filled blood. And the umbilical vein is carrying nutrient-rich, oxygenated blood from the mother's placenta. There are two umbilical veins, and there's only one. There are two umbilical arteries, and there is one umbilical vein that heads to the baby. There are some additional, now where do these veins connect? So if we look at the baby's circulatory system, this is the inferior vena cava. So this is normally in the normal circulatory system. This is where deoxygenated blood from the legs and from the lower half of the body is coming back. Wastes and things are coming back from the lower part of the body. And those are coming back from the baby, from the lower half of the baby as well. There's waste. But the umbilical vein mixes with the vena cava. So oxygen, nutrient-rich blood is mixing with deoxygenated blood from the baby. So here we're getting both, the bloods are mixing. Babies don't they don't have such demand for perfect oxygenated blood because they're growing, and while that takes a lot of energy, they're very small. And the amount of metabolizing that they're doing doesn't have to be so great because they're not running around doing crazy things yet. The descending aorta, so this is where nutrient-rich blood and normally oxygenated blood would be going down. This is where it branches down, sort of down here somewhere in the iliac region, and it branches off to the umbilical arteries, and that's taking deoxygenated blood. So in babies, there's oxygenated and deoxygenated blood are mixing together. That's why when babies are born, they're terribly ugly. They're super ugly because they have purple blood, basically. They have deoxygenated and oxygenated blood all throughout them, and so they look purple, just like the purple blood here in this image. They look terrible and purple until they take that first breath. when they take their first breath, they take a huge breath, and all that lung tissue expands. That lung tissue, all those sacs, everything expands. It basically becomes a vacuum in there and forces blood forces blood into the pulmonary circuit. A huge volume of blood, a wave of blood goes into the pulmonary circuit, fills those lungs, becomes oxygenated for the first time, that first all-important breath, and then travels out through the pulmonary vein and shoots in, that first wave that shoots into the left ventricle, and when it does that, the actual force of the blood closes the foramen ovale. It slams it shut. That's why the first breath, the baby's first breath, is so important to shut that valve. There is a condition, I forget what it's called, where that valve doesn't close properly. Premature babies, because what happens is there's a flap in that valve. There's a flap, basically, and if in premature babies, the flap's too small to close the valve properly. So when the thing slams, also the lungs are underdeveloped, not enough force, all kinds of things like that in preemie babies. So sometimes doctors have to go in and shut this manually. Also, the arterial duct, as blood now is coursing into the pulmonary circuit, it's easier for it to actually go into the lungs now than it was into the arterial duct, because the arterial duct is smaller. So it starts to bypass the duct. And this actually triggers the cells that are lining the duct to start dividing, and they basically close the duct off. And then that tissue becomes a tendon, essentially. It becomes connective tissue and connects the pulmonary artery to the aortic arch. So it anchors, because the aortic arch is huge and the pulmonary artery are big, so they are anchored together so they don't move around now, they don't get damaged, they have that ductus arterius. That's what it does. And then, so that the foramen ovale, it gets shut, it grows over, it's gone. The the arterial duct turns into a tendon, and all of these other, these other tissues, basically, the hormones and stuff cause them to, cause them to atrophy, to close up and get reabsorbed by the body. The umbilical cord is cut. Usually the dad comes along. I have cut some umbilical cords. The umbilical cord is cut, and then it's tied off, and it sticks out of the baby, and it atrophies, and it rots. So newborn babies smell like rotting tissue, like bacteria, and they smell disgusting because they have a rotting flesh sticking out of their belly button. Also, after the baby is born, there's the afterbirth is what happens. Do we have that here? Is the afterbirth, and the afterbirth is the placenta. So a mother will then, shortly after the baby is born, a mother will deliver the placenta. The placenta will be born, and the mother expels that organ. She's done with it. No, don't need it no more. Another thing to note. Here's the liver, and here's the blood vessel. There's the blood coming from the mother. This blood, basically, the liver's not working here. The kidneys aren't working in the babies, and this blood, the way you see it bypasses, most of the blood bypasses the liver. So the liver isn't very developed. So the liver's not detoxifying this blood. It's relying on the mum to have toxin-free blood. As a result, that's why it is recommended that moms don't drink alcohol, because if that placental blood is full of alcohol, the baby will not, that alcohol will just flow right down here, right to the developing baby, right to the developing baby's brain, and impair that development. It will not, the baby's liver will not process that alcohol and break it down. It's basically, the baby will be stewing in toxic booze. And anything else, any other drugs that the mother takes and are dissolved in the blood will be going to the baby. That's it for fetal circulatory system.